Welcome back to those who were with us the last time, and those who watched the first part on YouTube will be able to catch up, and those who did not, really, in a way, these are three separate parts. Ideally, we should listen to them or talk about them in sequence, but we can start any place we want to. We're talking, as you know, roughly, if we round up to the next 100 years, I said the last time, it's a total of 2,100 years, really. If you start from the time Roman rule began in our homeland, where we come from, which is 64 BC to today, we're talking about 2,100 years. Split these in three, and they split very nicely into three components. We stopped the last time we were here when the Arab conquest had just started, when the Maronites, who were already in Mount Lebanon, right? We talked that around 400 and on, the disciples of Marmaroon were already there preaching and converting the folks in Mount Lebanon to Christianity. Many in Lebanon were already Christian. We also discussed this. The coast was already Christian. We talked about the two cultures, the Syriac in the mountain and the Greek on the coast. And we stopped about the time the Maronites took matters into their own hands and elected a patriarch and decided to move from where they were in Antioch of Syria around the banks of the Orontes River and walk down, literally, to Lebanon, to Hermel, where that river itself, in fact, began. And we stopped there. Today, we will delve deeply into the entire conquest, Arab and Muslim conquest. And there is a difference, by the way, because it started as Arab and Muslim, and then it became other ethnicities and Muslim. We'll explain that as we speak. And the next time we are here, Abuna will tell us when that will be. Still during Lent, it will be next month. We will do the last 700 years, which will start after the Crusades. That's where we are stopping today. And we'll end today. We'll end with us, the Lebanese diaspora. And so, as I did with the first lecture, we split this into parts. First, we're going to focus on the conquest and the spread of Islam, the rise of and the spread, where it began and how it began. And then we'll talk about the impact of the new religion on the Byzantine Empire, because it began on the borders of in Arabia, and the idea was to take it over and to spread a new religion and culture and language. And naturally, the impact on the Byzantine Empire is inclusive of, because Lebanon was already part of the Byzantine Empire, part of the earlier Roman Empire that transformed into Byzantine Empire. And we'll talk about others who joined those who were already in Lebanon, right? We said also the last time that many people were in Lebanon. We started our discussion, you may recall, talking about the people in the land of Canaan. So they existed, and the Greeks referred to them as the Phoenicians. But we also said there were others in the mountains, and many more came, including the Maronites. Let me start with a new calendar. The last time we were here, we talked about the different calendars. We said we'll use only one, the Gregorian calendar, the one that we use, the one that began subsequent to the birth of Christ. But we talked about the calendar that was in existence before, which ended essentially the year or so before the birth of Christ. But also with the new religion, there is a new calendar. We will not use this calendar, although others who are members of that religion do use it. But given the subject of our talk, Christianity, we will continue with the calendar that began with Christianity, and that essentially most of the world on a daily basis uses it. It began 10 years prior to the death of the Prophet Muhammad. in 622. The Prophet Muhammad, during that year, had to leave where he was living. He was living in Mecca, to a new city north of Mecca. And they used that year as the starting point of the spread of the religion, for good reasons, because the religion was not spreading in Mecca. In fact, there was a lot of pushback. Other than the inner circles of the Prophet, not many people were ready to listen. And so he was literally pushed back. He was just asked to leave along with his followers to Medina. And that is the year that the Muslim calendar begins. This year, 2025, to put things in context, is equal to 1446. It's the Hijrah calendar, is in the year of the Hijrah, just like we talked about the last time we were here, about in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's the after the birth of Christ. So this is in the year of the Hijrah. That's where it comes from. How did Islam emerge? I just said that it emerged in the city where the Prophet Muhammad was living. Around 610, the Prophet indicated to his most inner circle, really starting with his wife, that he is hearing messages. And he attributes these messages to God. And that these messages were being passed on to him through the angel Gabriel. And then he took it upon himself to share these messages, initially with his wife, and subsequently with his most trusted family, including one who will later become a Khalifa within the Islamic States. We'll talk about him, Ali, but also others that he referred to as trusted advisors. Those trusted advisors, we will learn later, that while they were not necessarily blood relatives, they actually were through marriage. And we will talk about that as well. Initially, the message was spread in Arabia, today's Saudi Arabia. But the Prophet did ask anyone who was hearing that message that they also do the same. He wanted that message spread and shared as widely as possible. And in fact, among these messages that Muhammad himself was receiving from Gabriel, from God, according to the religion, through Gabriel, that became the Quran. A number of surahs, or a number of sections, parts, entries in the Quran do call Muslims to actually spread the faith. Ad-da'wah, it's called in Arabic. And that is a core tenet of faith. Those who are able to must do so. And so very quickly then, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, his followers decided to go ahead and spread the message. What they wanted to do, actually, is conquer the Byzantine Empire. This was a dual approach to spreading the message. The logic was, if we take over the Byzantine Empire and we teach everyone, one way or another, Arabic and the culture of Arabia, they will be able to learn Islam, because they will be able to study the Quran. And so they began, and I'll show you a map, moving in all directions from where it all began, Arabia, today's Saudi Arabia, and said that all non-believers will be converted in one form or another. And those who don't want to convert, and many did not, many resisted, but if you don't want to convert, there is a way out for you, particularly for those who are Jews or Christians, the people of the book. They will have to pay a tax. Often it's a heavy tax beyond the ability of most people to pay. Hence why many people, in fact, did end up converting to the religion. This does not mean that nobody actually accepted and believed. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is quite a bit of the conversion occurred as a result of the jizya, or the inability to pay the jizya. Immediately after the death of Muhammad, and as the conquest began, there was a significant schism. Schisms happen in religions. They happened, you may recall, from the last time we were here, in the Church of Antioch. among the Christians there was basically a split. There was a disagreement over a number of things, mostly theological. Here, the schism occurred over who will take over, who will inherit the leadership of this new religion. The majority of the people said it should be a trusted person, a learned person, an advisor who spent a lot of time with the prophet, who understands the religion. And others said it should be a bloodline. This is very common in that part of the world, right? It still is common today. It should not be an advisor. Advisors play important roles, but it should be just like a piece of land that one passes on to, say, to his descendants. So should this possession, the new religion, it should go to a bloodline. That schism and this division has stayed with the religion and has impacted the doctrine itself, the faith, but also how it's run and how in the end maps were drawn. So let's go back to then where the religion started. If you look at the green, both dark and light, this is today's Saudi Arabia, in addition to a number of countries that are called collectively the United Arab Emirates, plus Qatar, plus Yemen, and Oman. At the time, there were no boundaries. And when you see boundaries, because we are using today's maps. At the time, Islam was essentially very localized around Medina and around Mecca. Actually, I wanted to point something to you that is important. It's important to know. If you look at the legend here, look at where there's a cross from the top, 1, 2, 3, 4. City with major Christian presence. And then scan the map of Arabia and see how many times, how often from the top, from the Ghassanids and all the way down to Najran, how often these crosses appear. This was basically a land where Christians, Jews before them, and also pagans lived, and now becoming Muslim. Early on, acceptance was limited. And also, I'll step back a little bit because I think this is important for you to put things in context. The lighter green is where there is a heavy concentration of Sunni. Those who follow the advisor line of succession. And where there is dark, this is where there's heavy concentration of Shia, those who followed the bloodline. I mentioned one of these caliphs, Ali. Those who followed Ali are concentrated. If you know the map, and I know you know the map, but I'll mention the countries. It's primarily Iran. Of course, there are other dots everywhere else, but it's primarily Iran and southern Iraq.
Ali was not Khalifa.
Sorry?
He was not Khalifa.
He was the fourth of the Rashidun Khalifa. He was the first Imam. We can have that conversation. He was the fourth of the Rashidun Khalifa. We're going to talk about that. And so, while the topic was to manage to unite those stars around the religion, this is basically the dark green is where it all began. Where this? Oh, thank you. Yes. Can you clip it, please?
Yeah. And it
Thank you.
didn't click.
You can.
Here. Here. Ah, from here. Okay, from the other side now. Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Jamil? Oh, we'll find out. Okay, right. You can hear me in the room, but those who watch the video, they'll let us know. And so, as you can see, they went in all directions, but primarily toward the Byzantine Empire. Look at the Mediterranean Sea. We'll come back. We'll see this map or a variation of this map many times. They were successful within a short period of time. Within 4 years, in 636, Jerusalem fell. And 2 more years, quite a bit of the Levant a large chunk of the Byzantine Empire fell, including, of course, Lebanon. Just remember this, anytime Jerusalem fell, Lebanon fell. Anytime Jerusalem was liberated, Lebanon was liberated. Remember that. That's Hayd al-I'adi. It always happened as such. And eventually the Byzantine Empire was exhausted by all kinds of forces, not only against the Arab and Muslim conquest, but they still had to deal with others, Persians, for example. It took a long time, but eventually the empire fell, but we will get to that. What was the impact on Lebanon? If you look at Lebanon today, of course, it's a mosaic where people from different religions are living side by side. Very common to see a church and a mosque side by side, and this is downtown Beirut, as you know. But as Lebanon fell, when Jerusalem fell, as I said earlier, Lebanon was integrated into the caliphate, but not all of Lebanon fell. It was always easy to tackle the coastal land, but the mountains always gave the conquerors a hard time. And in fact, they never fully submitted, even though the land itself was under the jurisdiction of a certain empire. They were able, almost always, one way or another, to have some form of autonomy and some form of freedom. And this is how Christianity actually lasted. In places where people didn't convert, and that was Lebanon, for example, in many places people did, as I said earlier, for one reason or another. But in places where people did not convert, did not accept the new religion, the conquerors brought their own people who were already part of the religion or from new lands where they accepted the religion. And that happened in Lebanon very, very often. But Mount Lebanon became always, or remained always a haven for persecuted Christians in Lebanon and also elsewhere. How did that happen? Because they defended their homeland. You remember the last slide or two that we discussed last time. It was about creating a homeland. That's what the Maronites did in Lebanon. They created a homeland for themselves, but also for other Christians, those who were there already when the Maronites arrived, but also others who came subsequently. And so they decided that they will fight back. And they lived in places where they were able to do it. So this is just one sample picture of where they were living in the mountains. I want to, if it's possible, to draw your attention to something I'll say here, that they decided they will fortify these self-sustaining strongholds by creating everything and anything they need to survive. They had no idea how long this was going to last. You know, it started in 636. And I think you know when the last caliphate left, right? 1918, very long time. That's when the last caliphate left. They had no idea. But they knew that difficult times are ahead. Take a look how rugged this landscape is, but focus on just this small part here. What do you see? The small part, you see these terraces. These are the farms. When they taught us that they took rocks and created farms, and they destroyed them with their own hearts. There was no machinery. This is what they were doing. That's what they were planting, and that's what they were eating, and they built their churches, they built their religious Christian institutions, whatever it took for them to be insulated and therefore to be able to survive. One other thing they did, in addition to being able to last as a result of their ingenuity and faith, they made up with the Byzantines. You may recall we talked that about the time of the Maronites electing their own patriarch, which was actually on the heels of other issues they had with the Byzantines, like the destruction of Beit Maroun, an important monastery that the followers of Mar Maroun built. They were actually very unhappy, the Byzantines, with what the Maronites did. Basically, they left. They had to. There was no patriarch. There was no religious leaders, and they were fending off all kinds of attacks, including the Arab conquest had just begun, and they said, we need a leader. And we talked about that leader. We talked about how that leader himself was fighting at the top of his army in Lebanon and elsewhere. But they decided, well, maybe we don't want to continue to fight with essentially people that were like them. The Byzantines, where they were living in Antioch, were actually their neighbors. They were ethnically the same, essentially. And they decided that maybe we can go back and work with Constantine and get some help, because the mountains of Lebanon, compared to the Byzantine Empire, there's no comparison. And on their own, they weren't going to be able to do it. And because of that relationship, they were able to, in fact, truly fight back. This isn't just written words in history. We're going to talk about that. Truly fight back and truly fend off all these attacks, and this is what allowed them to actually survive. But who did the fighting? Who did the fighting? Essentially, anyone who was able actually did. But we studied and we were taught in the history books and stories about some very feisty and very courageous people who, in the 7th century, when the Arab conquest began, were living in Mount Lebanon, and they were essentially those people who were holding the fort. I think you all know the terminology, Al-Marada, or Midites, was an organized Christian resistance in Mount Lebanon. Historians still today go back and forth as to who they were. For us, it doesn't matter. We're not going to go into a lab with the DNA and figure it out. For example, as to whether they are actually the Maronites or not. Scientifically, one could surmise that they are, and I'll talk briefly about it. But what's important to us is what they did to survive. That is the only thing that I think, from a historical point of view, we need to focus on. They were living in the mountains. And it's not a myth. It's not a myth. There is a book by a Byzantine historian that was written before that person actually became a Christian, a monk, and subsequently a saint, revered on the eastern side of Christianity, Theophanes the Confessor. He actually refers to the Marada by name and saying that they lived in the mountains, starting, you may recall something like this map, right, where this orange is, right below it is Antioch, right below it is the northern coastal part of Syria, and right below it is Lebanon. And Theophanes specifically mentioned the Marada that were living in these mountains, who were brave, who were very autonomous, and they repelled anyone, didn't matter who that one person is, away from their precious mountains. And they actually controlled them all the way down into the Galilee with some influence in Jerusalem. So they were very important people when it comes to presence and to deal with. And we're going to talk about later on how the invading forces had to actually deal with, literally make agreements, literally pay the money to just step back. So the Marada, many people say, oh, maybe they were Greek. Oh, maybe they were Persian. Maybe even they were Armenian, because they do come from where the Armenians came from. But we do know one thing. They were Christian living in the mountain before the Maronites arrived. And we know another thing. They spoke Syriac. So I don't think we need to be geniuses to say they're very close. We know where they came from. They came from the Hatay, and you told me about Hatay, I forgot its name today, in today's Turkey. They came from that part of the world speaking Syriac, which is what everyone spoke at that time. But their work with the Maronites, whether they were the Maronites, whether they came together with the Maronites, it didn't matter. These people together fought a common enemy to survive, the Marada and the Maronites, and they became a symbol for struggle, and they gave confidence to others, because there were other Christians, of course, all over that part of the world, the Levant, that you can actually fight back and you can survive. And so what happened? So they marched from Arabia in all directions. They made it to Lebanon. Who were they? A series of caliphates. We're going to talk about all of them except two today. The first was the Rashidun. The Arabic word for it, it comes from Rushd. We'll come back and say why they are called Rashidun. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Seljuks, the Ayyubids. And the next time we are here, because during that period, Seljuk and Ayyubids, the Crusaders came. And they took over, but unfortunately, they only lasted 200 years and somebody else came back. So we'll talk about this. And the last caliphate, as I said earlier, was dissolved on paper in 1922. They left Lebanon. Always our interest in this is Lebanon, how it impacted Lebanon. They left Lebanon in 1918. The Rashidun, the rightly guided, Rushd, Camille, you're good with Arabic, right? The Rashiduns. These were
The mature.
the mature. They tell us you can only vote when you are 21 because you are Rashid. تبلغ سن الرشد. So these were the mature. These were people around the Prophet Muhammad. These were the Sunni branch of Islam. They were his advisors, and they were, in one way or another, closely related. We will talk about this a little bit. So, I'm sorry? There were 4 of them, and we will talk about them. And so their capital is where Islam started, naturally. If you look at the dark purple, this is where the Rashiduns were. The empire grew, and these are the other colors, but we'll talk about the other colors, the light brown, and even lighter brown. But what the Rashiduns did is also expand. They came out of Arabia, and they expanded, as you can see. Keep an eye on the Mediterranean Sea in the middle, Lebanon, and anything that is surrounding Lebanon also fell to the Rashidun. What was the impact? Well, on the coast, it was total influence. But the Christians had already realized that something is happening and we must protect ourselves. They had fortified their strongholds in the mountains. They either fought to remain faithful or they paid the price, the heavy price no matter what. At the time, the other branch did not exist in Lebanon. The Rashiduns basically were 4 caliphates. The first one, Abu Bakr, was a father-in-law. The Prophet was married his daughter. The second one, Umar, the Prophet was married his daughter. The third one, Uthman, was married to the Prophet's daughter. The fourth one, and Uthman was a second cousin. The fourth one, Ali ibn Abi Talib, was a cousin and also married to the Prophet's daughter. So
He was married to Muhammad. He was married to Muhammad's daughter.
yeah, the first 2, he was married to their daughters. The second 2, they were married to his daughters. So we will talk about them. You can say that the Sunni branch of Islam arrived in Lebanon then with the Rashidun. When Lebanon fell, those who converted under the Rashidun, they were Sunnis, right? So that's when we had the early arrival, and this, by the way, continued. There was some on and off. We will talk about it. There was conversions. The coast was easily taken, usually, because of its geography. And the mountain fought back because of its geography and the valiant people that lived there. No, but the last time, we talked about the name just emerging with no boundaries, right? There was not. It was the Levant. It was the Levant, the whole geographic area, and some called it Phoenicia, and some called it Canaan, right? But about that time, 6th, 7th century, the name, the mountains of Lebanon began to be used, began to emerge, but no boundaries were drawn yet. And we also talked very early in that lecture how big the Silsilat al-Mountain, the mountain chain was, right? We said it extended into beyond southern Lebanon and beyond, let's call it that, beyond northern Lebanon, right? Into the neighboring countries. But there were no boundaries. But if you consult, of course, the name Lebanon, we also talked about this, was in the Old Testament so many times, and we used some examples. And the cities that are today in Lebanon, part of the Levant, were and are in the New Testament. We know that. And so additional migration happened on and off all the way through the last caliphate, meaning under the Ottomans, many more came because there was resistance to conversion and there was a need to defend the caliphates because, as you see the map, the Mediterranean was open to the west. And so if you didn't convert and you didn't have enough people there to do your work, the work on your behalf, then we'll bring our own people. That was the logic. Then came the Umayyads. The Umayyads were essentially neighbors. Their capital was in Damascus, and the Umayyads grew further. If you look toward Persia, how much they expanded, and also if you look toward Europe, today's Spain, and you see Al-Andalus in the middle, they actually made a significant expansion. They were fighters, and they took over a lot of land, and they were Sunnis just like the Rashiduns in three, at this time, not only in Asia, in three continents, in Europe and in Africa. They realized that people can't convert, they can't become Muslims and pray unless they spoke Arabic. That was the first time where Arabization was actually forced. We get to a place, we start teaching Arabic. You have to speak Arabic, you cannot speak your language anymore. Unless you are feisty and you fight and you're in the mountains of Lebanon and you can defend yourself and you hold on to your Syriac language. The impact on Lebanon, of course, very quickly they took over the coast and very quickly they brought people to the coast. As always, the Christians in the mountains resisted. They were able to pray, but even if they resisted, they were surrounded by the caliphate. And so to exist, they had to pay the jizya. But the Marada and the Maronites, and I personally believe they are one, or say became one, they share the same roots, actually fought back and fought hard. And I mentioned the last time I was here, early on during the conquest, certain Byzantine rulers were willing to make deals with the advancing forces to save themselves and to save some piece of land for themselves. And so I'm going to come back to this toward the end of our conversation when I talk about migration to Cyprus. The first time migration out of Lebanon, right? They were coming into Lebanon. The first time Christians left was when the Byzantines made a deal with advancing Arab forces, promising that they'll find a way to lessen the intensity of the attacks, and in fact, moved people out of the mountains to Cyprus. At that time, they actually moved people, not by choice, the people just had to move. That was the very early wave of migration to Cyprus. And they got money. They got some rulers, we know this, can be corrupt. Shia by then had started to come. Basically by then, Shia meaning those who supported Ali. They started to come because in various places where there were supporters to Ali, the caliphate did not want them. And they pressured them, and many of them began to arrive in Lebanon. Next came the Abbasids, and they're credited basically with being more peaceful. Of course, the Abbasids also wanted more land. They needed control of the land, because if you don't control the land, you don't control the people. Their capital was not as close as their predecessors. They were in Baghdad. Initially, the Abbasids came in saying that they were Shia, but they ruled as Sunnis. We will see later, when we talk about the next caliphate, that there were still remnants of them who actually were Shia. And they split off and formed their own caliphate. We will get to this one, which is not unusual, right? We know that in Iran and in Iraq, there was actually a large population that very quickly became supporters of Ali. In Arabic, تشيعوا لعلي. They are in Iran and they are in Iraq. Their impact on Lebanon was very similar. If you wanted to practice your Christianity, you'll pay the jizya. You cannot have a cross on your church. The Maronite patriarch moved under the Abbasids to Yanuh. Does anyone know where Yanuh is? Bijabal Lebanon, near Aoura, very high above the mountains. We will talk about why they left Kfar Hay and moved to Yanuh. We'll talk about this next. Christians were brave enough to revolt against taxation a number of times. The last time I was here, friends from the Matan and from the Bukal said, what about our ancestors who fought back? Yes, in various places, but the two well-known revolts were in Baskinta and went toward Bekaa, a significant revolt, and one that began in Nitra and went toward Baalbek. And during that period, because Antioch was under quite a bit of pressure and attack by advancing forces, even though it had fallen to advancing forces, many continued to come to Lebanon because Mount Lebanon was a story that everyone knew about that had remained free, and you can practice your Christianity. And of course, eventually, around 936 or so, there was one final attack. There were other attacks that we discussed last time we were here, including one that we were termed as a devastating one on Beit Marun. But there were still other smaller monasteries that were part of the Maronites' presence in Antioch. And there was a final attack that drove many more Maronites to Mount Lebanon. But also, during that time, other Arab tribes who became very influential subsequently in Lebanon's history, Lakhmids, Tanukhids, and Kahtanis, they came from Arabia, some northern Arabia and some southern Arabia. We will talk about them also as hired help. They came in for a job. They got not only payments in currency, but also other privileges. Some of them became Druze. When they came, I'm a little bit ahead of myself, but just in case you're wondering, when they came, actually they were Shia. Prior to this, they were Christian in Arabia, became Shia in Egypt, and then came to Lebanon as hired help, and subsequently converted or followed the Druze. Al-Muwahhidin is the proper name. Shia also by then had larger numbers and were able to revolt and defend themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the Al-Muwahhidin, also known as Ad-Druze. Sometimes we hear the term Bani or Banu Ma'ruf in English is the children of good deeds. They came in for various reasons, including persecution. The Shia came in for various reasons, including persecution. We said that Lebanon actually was open to anyone who wanted to flee persecution elsewhere where they were living, starting with the Maronites and other Christians. The Lakhmids and Tanukhids came from Iraq, and they came during the Abbasids from a part of Egypt that actually had Shia and had Abbasids rulers who ruled within this Sunni caliphate as Shia. And we will talk about them next, in fact. And they adopted the Druze faith later on, a little bit after the year 1000, and they settled in Mount Lebanon. Look at the center of Lebanon. But the majority also in Wadi Time, and there may be people from this part of our world who would know this, which straddles more than one country in that part of the world, and many, many more in Suwaida. At Suwaida, the largest concentration of Druze today is actually in Syria, in the southern part of Syria that spills into Jordan. But they became very influential, especially the Man family. The Banu Man, who also came from Arabia, specifically from Yemen, they're a collection of tribes. The major one that came to Lebanon was the Qahtani tribe. By the time they actually arrived, the Druze were thriving, small numbers, thriving in Mount Lebanon. The reason for it is the Druze always found ways to be helpful to the ruler. They always had a niche for themselves through today. That's how a very small sect and offshoot of Islam has survived and thrived the way it has under all kinds of, this is history, not politics, under all kinds of regimes, from inception, from these times to today. All you have to do is look at the modern history of Lebanon. The Banu Man gave us a ruler, a Druze ruler that we all revere and we love because he unified Lebanon. Who was he? Fakhruddin. Fakhruddin al-Mani. Thank you, Camille.
Can I say a word?
You can say anything you'd like.
Just before the Druze came from Christian, you said Christian.
No,
Shia.
they came from Shia.
You said they were Christian?
Before Shia, they were, like many Arab tribes, they were Christian.
Christian to Shia.
Yeah. They originally, in Arabia, they were Christian.
Yeah, but before that,
Pagans.
They were Jews.
Pagans. No, the Druze religion.
The story that I've read. It's all right.
There was no thing as Druze at the time, right? It didn't happen until 1020. So they were in Arabia Christian. They came into Egypt and they converted at the hands of a local ruler who was practicing a form of Shia, Ismaili Shia, and subsequently made it into Lebanon. I mean, there is room for all kinds of opinions and ideas and facts, right? I'm not going to dismiss anything, but the calendar is pretty clear who started, right? When Christianity started, when Islam started, when the offshoots of Christianity and Islam started. That calendar is pretty set and not open to dispute. You know, the last time we were here, we talked a little bit about the difference in opinion, even in theology, and there is room for this. I want to believe in this. I believe that when it comes to history, you have to believe in actually what happened. And even in history, sometimes you'll find differences in opinions, but you find enough people overlapping on something to say, oh, it must be this, right? So it's a range, and some people would be on either side of that range, but you'll find enough sources and enough documentation that says, it's probably this, right? And so there is a little bit of room for interpretation, but not a lot. Because they were a minority, well, I didn't say what I wanted to say. They actually, look, let me go back a little bit. Look at, I know I'm going in the wrong way. Look at the map for the Abbasids, right? Look how big that caliphate was, the Abbasids. And look at the green. And now, let's come here to the Fatimids and see how small that is. Because the Abbasids didn't go away. They actually overlapped. If you look at the years 909 to 1171, if you look at the Abbasids 750 to 1258, this happened all the time. Caliphates changed hands, but the previous one did not totally disappear. That's not how it worked. They held on to something. The Byzantine Empire lost a lot of land. The caliphates essentially overtook them. But there was still something called the Byzantine Empire because they didn't lose all the land. They didn't lose all the influence in all places. The Fatimids are actually an offshoot of the Abbasids who came into the caliphate initially saying they were Shia, but ruling as Sunnis because they had to, because they needed to expand into the Sunni geography. The Shia geography was so small. And so the Fatimids were very localized, and they essentially started in Cairo. And they were a rival to the Abbasids. This is the first Shia caliphate. Everything we talked about so far, including the Rashidun, has been Sunni. There was one caliph under the Rashidun who, let's call him, who is revered not only by Shia but also all Muslims and others, that's Ali. He was the first Imam of Shia, but the caliphate itself was not. The caliphate was not a bloodline. Even though he was a cousin, it was a Sunni. It was whomever is the most learned. Here, these Fatimids were actually descendants of Fatima and Ali. Ali, that caliph, who married Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, had descendants. These descendants, yes, exactly, Hassan wal Hussein. These descendants first overtook land from the prior caliphate in northern Africa. And then they took Egypt, and then, of course, they came into what we would call the Levant, the Near East, and so on. How are you doing on time, Abuna? Running late? Okay. So we will start pick it up. And so during that period, there was an expansion. Yeah, because we're supposed to have this conversation after, but that's okay. I don't like to dismiss a comment or a question, but we can pick up some of this. I think the picture is clear right now. So depends on the caliphate, something happens in terms of geography and population, right? And so now there was an expansion in the Shia community. They were already in Lebanon. We talked about it in Mount Lebanon. But there was a huge expansion in South Lebanon. Let me just point out Jabal Amel. Jabal Amel is named after the Banu Amila, a Yemeni tribe that came to Lebanon and directly into South Lebanon, who were actually Shia. And so the Fatimids also had someone displace them. That was the Seljuk. I can go over the Seljuk and the Ayyubids rather quickly because neither controlled Lebanon. They were on the outskirts. They are important because, as I said earlier, their focus was on Jerusalem, and when that is the case, then their focus is at least on the coastal Lebanon. So they wanted Jerusalem, the two of them. They began in Central Asia. They took over from the Abbasids, right? Because the larger caliphate was Abbasids, and they had multiple capitals, including Baghdad. Impact on Lebanon, really very little. But when they focused on Jerusalem and when they had fights to actually conquer Jerusalem, it impacted Lebanon. They discriminated against Shia, and the Shia had to continue to move into remote areas. Another caliphate or a sultanate was the Ayyubid. They were not in Lebanon also. Their focus was on Jerusalem, but we do know Salah ad-Din, right? Salah ad-Din's exclusive focus was on Jerusalem, and he got it and lost it and got it and lost it. This is basically what he wanted. And look at Salah ad-Din's caliphate. The focus was where Jerusalem is in the neighborhood, right? You have to be able to defend it. That's why Lebanon is so important to any conqueror who's interested in Jerusalem. Their initial capital was Cairo because they overthrew the Fatimids. They ruled essentially Egypt and Syria, but they had some presence in Iraq and Yemen. The Crusaders were in Lebanon at the time. That's why Salah ad-Din did not conquer Lebanon. Although some of the cities, as I said, when Jerusalem falls, cities in Lebanon will fall, did fall to Salah ad-Din, and that's when we got the Kurdish community. The start of the Kurdish community in Lebanon was when Salah ad-Din, who was Kurdish himself, was in charge. They suppressed the Shia and they tried to actually convert him. 500 years of this, and we're still here. And our ancestors and our relatives and our loved ones are still there. They protected the homeland. The homeland that they created in the 7th century was protected. That's how it was protected. All you have to do here is just look at the picture. They fought, they paid the tax, they did all they had to do to maintain their autonomy. There were skirmishes. Remember, others came into Mount Lebanon, but overall, they remained in charge of their homelands. Many more Maronites came. Yohanna Maroon, the 4th patriarch, came down and said, this is it. This is our final homeland. You know, like us, when we left Lebanon, just go back and think about this. What were you thinking? One day I'm going back. Anytime you leave a place that you love, in the back of your mind is one day I'm going to go back. When the Maronites came to Mount Lebanon, one day they were going to go back. But now, the Maronites realized that there was too much efforts, a lot of efforts, for good reasons, a lot of blood, a lot of sacrifices to create this homeland. And now we are affirming that this is a final homeland for the Christians, not only the Maronites, because I always say this, there were many other Christians in that part of the world. Some of us are represented here. So that homeland was created, of course, initially its core in Mount Lebanon. I don't have to go over what we will cover. You'll see it as I cover it. What time is it, Abuna? Yeah. All right. So, unfortunately, while all that was happening, there was a significant issue brewing between Western and Eastern Christianity. The picture tells it all. Primarily, at the time, we know that earlier, Chalcedon, you remember Chalcedon from the last time we were here. Earlier, it was basically theological, but now it's administrative. Who's in charge? Administrative, right? So there was a disagreement between Rome and the rest of the founding churches, patriarchates, as to who is in charge. The idea was Rome has a special place in Christianity, and of course that patriarch, the patriarch of Rome, is first among equal. But he wanted more. He wanted to be supreme in every possible decision. And Constantinople at the time was at its height. They were having difficulties. The Seljuks were basically taking land here and there from them. But also Europe was not quite out of its Middle Ages, but it was becoming more unified. It was becoming stronger, and the Pope wanted to assert himself. So he decided, the Pope, to send someone to talk to the Patriarch of Constantinople. He sent a cardinal. This was Pope Leo IX. He sent Cardinal Humbert, and he said, why don't you take a ride on your horse to Constantinople and meet with Patriarch Michael Cerularius I. Greek Orthodox in this room know that this is a saint and revered and an important figure in their church. And let's see if we can actually resolve these matters with that patriarch. The idea is to convince that patriarch that Rome is indeed supreme. And so it took a long time, actually from April to July, for Michael I to agree to meet with Cardinal Humbert. But they didn't have a good conversation. And so Humbert left, went to Hagia Sophia, and left some paperwork that he had brought with him as Plan B. The idea was, we'll resolve the matter. But if we couldn't resolve the matter, we're going to tell him we're in charge. He left papers of excommunication for the Patriarch of Constantinople, saying, you're not Christian anymore. You have no authority here. Our Pope, the person in charge, is going to lead even this. What Humbert presumably did not know is that the Pope had died in the meanwhile, between April and July. And these papers were no longer valid according to the Patriarch of Constantinople. Some of it is really laughable. But that's the reality. And then Michael says, oh, then I can do to them, because I'm still alive, what they did to me. I am going to excommunicate you. Mutual excommunications created a schism. The schism gave us two churches, the Western and the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic. Obviously, the Western used the term Catholic, and the Eastern used the term Orthodox. Let me explain something to you that I think many of you would know, but let me just put some efforts into this to realize that really the differences are so minute and not worth what has happened to Christianity. Essentially, the early church was just a Christian church. It had no other name. Catholic and Orthodox were not in the name of the church. Catholic was referring, if you pick up the dictionary and find the word Catholic, it actually refers to something that is all-encompassing, universal, right? Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Matthew 10:40, right, Abuna? This is telling us that the Christian church is all-encompassing, is Catholic. We say it in our creed. Not only we, everyone says it, that one holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Both churches are that. Orthodox, what does Orthodox mean? Orthodox actually simply refers to creed, what Jesus taught us, what the disciples taught us. This is the true faith. And if you move away from it, it's not Orthodox. It's as simple as that. So the differences that go back to Chalcedon may be a little bit more meaningful. And even that line blurred, but the real differences over what created the schism is, in my humble opinion, as a scientist, not as a historian, as a scientist, is actually, they are nearly non-existent. There are some differences, and like with everything else, one should be tolerant with a little dissent here and there, but it does not deserve what actually happened to Christianity, where there are in the Catholic Church 1 plus 22 individual churches. The one is, of course, the Western Roman Catholic, right? And the rest, we are one of the 22, including others, Chaldeans, Syriac, Armenians, and of course, the Orthodox Church is the Orthodox Church, but with independent autocephalous churches are called This isn't historical, meaning this, what I'm talking about now, isn't 1054, is now essentially. Subsequent popes and patriarchs of Constantinople tried to bring back the two sides of the lung. The church must breathe with her two lungs, said Pope John Paul II, and made significant progress. And agreed, actually, that the differences were minute. And in fact, in 1965, both the Pope, the Roman Pope, and the Patriarch of Constantinople said, we'll withdraw all paperwork that caused this mess. But they haven't just yet come together. Continue to pray that the two lungs of the church come back together. The final section here is the Crusades. Let us continue to go through this and take a little break so you can have your dinner and something to drink. We'll come back to answer Camille's questions. The idea was we need to free and secure Jerusalem. Jerusalem is very important for not both. Let's not forget, for all three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so there was a time when Christians were not able to go to Jerusalem. It was taken over and essentially encapsulated. It was only for one religion. And the West wasn't happy. But primarily, really, the Byzantine Empire also was realizing this may be near the end. They continued to take and take and take and take more, and so we need help. Despite differences, the Byzantine Empire told the Pope, we need help. The Pope said, of course, we are going to send you help. He sent the Crusaders, 9 different campaigns, lasted 200 years. They got to Lebanon in 1099, again en route to Jerusalem. They also, 10 years after, freed Tripoli, 11 years after, Beirut and Sidon, and 25 years after, freed Tyre. They were welcomed by the Christians. The Crusaders were welcomed. The Christians could breathe. Yes. Help them. I agree. They provided Crusaders military and logistical support. كانوا الدواويل. الدواويل, right? They actually helped them. They said, hey, Jerusalem is this way. There was no signs for Jerusalem, right? So somebody had to take them. Look, this is not a myth. Lebanon is at the center of all of this, right? Take a look at the geography. Europe, Asia, and Africa. So the Crusaders had to come down. They were coming from Europe. They began in France. They came to Constantinople, and they marched down through Lebanon all the way to Jerusalem. And so that's why, for example, in many of our cities, you see these beautiful things. These were built to defend, not Lebanon, to defend Jerusalem, to be able to secure the road to Jerusalem. I think probably most of us have been to all of these. If you have not, you should go. They are beautiful. These were built primarily by the Crusaders, sometimes on top of existing castles, maybe that they were destroyed, but primarily they came into being the way you see them because the Crusaders built them to defend Jerusalem. These are a little less known, but just as beautiful. I have not been to Sha'if or Anfi. I've been many times to Smarj Bel. Smarj Bel, not very well known, but Smarj Bel was for a very, very short period of time as they were preparing Farhai for the Patriarch. He actually stayed there for a very short period in Smarj Bel. But they needed to keep moving the Patriarch away from the coast because we said the coast fell first. We know who was in control on the coast, and we know that the mountain was free. That's why they kept moving higher and higher in the mountains. Many more in Saida. You probably were playing around this one, right? St. Louis and Saida, Tibnin and Sha'ra. So we're almost there. The Crusaders first succeeded. As I said, they succeeded. They freed Jerusalem. Many important cities around Antioch in the Byzantine Empire, in Lebanon, and all the way down to Jerusalem, and below coastal cities were freed and they were in charge. They actually created Crusader states. One of them was in our homeland, the county of Tripoli. The county of Tripoli was in Lebanon and Syria. That was a Crusader state. the Principality of Armenian Cilicia, Antioch, of course, the most important, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So it got a king, others got a prince, and so on. But of course, the caliphates fought back, and they won land back. And of course, the Crusaders would come back. So the second Crusader was to reclaim land that they had lost in the Byzantine Empire, but also in Jerusalem. It went, I would say, okay, because they did take some land back, but not all of it. They wanted to take Damascus. They were unable to do it, and they suffered very heavy losses. And it was the first crack in the relationship again between the West and the East, because the Crusaders thought that they could have had a little bit more help from the Byzantines, who did not. And they went back very disappointed. But something very important for this community happened then. Maronite union with the Holy See. Let me clarify. I told you this the last time I'm here. Anytime there is a difference in opinion, and on this one there is a lot, right? Many historians will say it didn't happen until a later period, a very long time after the first patriarch was elected. The Maronites say we were in communion with Rome from day one. I take that side, but I'll explain it. I think what they refer to, I said the last time I was here, when they elected the patriarch, there was a communication between the first patriarch for the Maronites and the Pope. I said the Pope was of originally Syrian, Antiochian background, that Pope, and had kept an eye to what was happening there. He was born himself in today's Italy, but his parents came from that part of the world. I believe the Maronites are referring to this communication as communion. That's perfectly fine. But perhaps both sides, and Abu Nahir can correct me even though it's not theology, both sides realize that there is a need to do a little bit more to affirm that. And so in 1131, Al-Halati from Halat, he received communication from Pope Innocent II, said, we recognize you as a self-governing Eastern Rite Roman Catholic. You are in communion. Let me just finish this. Come here if you don't mind. In 1182, the Patriarch, Peter of Lehfid, and his bishops said, we affirm. They worked with Lucius III, and I have that name twice, and they reaffirmed that communion. And finally, to make it firm, Rome invited to the Fourth Council of Lateran, they invited the Maronite Patriarch, Jeremiah al-Amshiti, in 1215, to sit at the table side by side with every other cardinal and the Pope as a full-fledged Catholic Patriarch of the East, creating the final and firm, until today, communion with the Holy See. This is when we began to adopt, but subsequently shave a little off, the Latinization in our church. I'll come back to you, Camille. Salah ad-Din came in with a vengeance. He wanted Jerusalem. We're going to go over this quickly. You can, of course, read those slides again online, and he did. He took it. The Crusaders came back and took it back. He came back and he took it again. By the way, a very important battle happened in Marjayun on the way to Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in Marjayun. And they made some, again, as I said, sometimes politics has a way to create some peace. They made a relationship that led to an agreement where, all right, you can have the kingdom back to the Crusaders, but we'll keep Jerusalem, but we'll open it to everyone. Pilgrims are welcome. But the Crusaders were not satisfied. They would come back one more time. We're going to talk about this. I mentioned to you a very small and early wave of migration toward Cyprus in the 8th and 9th century. A lot more migration, because as Camille reminded us, the Christians in Lebanon were of great help to the Crusaders. And they didn't hide this, because they had conviction. And when the Crusaders were not winning, when they actually were losing and they had to withdraw, they asked all people who helped them, who were of help to them, would you want to go back? Because they were still in charge, firmly in Cyprus. And they said, we are retreating to Cyprus, and anyone here who wants to come back, and not many, because remember, the Christians had created a homeland that they defended and paid dearly for. But some opted to go because they wanted maybe peace. They wanted a peace of mind. And many more followed, not only to Cyprus, but also to Malta and Rhodes. In 1340, the Maronites had a bishop in Cyprus. So there was enough Christianity of Maronite extraction to appoint a bishop. Things went bad in the fourth of 9 Crusader campaign to free Jerusalem. The division between East and West got really to a point where the Crusaders just turned around and said, our war is with Constantinople. Right? We all remember studying the sack of Constantinople, a very, very sad occurrence, event in the history of Christianity. And many people have not forgotten this to today. That's why it has taken so much time for reconciliation, that we all continue to pray, right? During Mass, we pray for reconciliation. And from there and on, it got even worse. The Crusaders lost the way, and they were fighting everywhere except in Jerusalem. And sadly, after 200 years, some other caliphate mustered enough strength and enough power to return. When we are here next, we will begin with the Mamluks. It was very, very difficult on the Christians in Lebanon. The Westerners were all killed, and many of the Christians who were of help to the Westerners were too. And this didn't just happen under the Mamluk. The Christians in Lebanon had to put up with 627 more years of the same. Thank you for being here.